What would you do if, on the very day your husband was supposed to sign the contract that could save everything, you stood in the market selling chilies one by one, while fate was already preparing a stranger's broken body for the back seat of your car? The morning had barely begun when two different roads opened in front of Jack and Tu Tien. One road led to a contract that might pull his company back from the edge. The other led to a village market where she would stand under the sun, selling the harvest like she had done so many times before, quietly turning sweat into small money for their survival. Neither of them knew that before the day ended, the contract would collapse, hope would be delayed once again, and an unconscious young woman lying on the roadside would force them to choose, in the middle of their own hardship, whether they still had enough heart left to save someone else. It was the kind of day that begins in ordinary tenderness and ends by testing everything love claims to be. Jack stepped out into the yard already dressed for battle. His tie was straight, his shirt clean, his expression controlled. But Tu Tien saw at once what no one else would have noticed. He looked neat, but not rested. Calm, but not light. The rows of drying winter melon and the bright red chilies spread under the early sunlight made the yard look almost peaceful. Yet peace had become something fragile in their home, something that could disappear with a single phone call. Tu Tien was arranging the produce when she looked up and saw him. For a second, her eyes brightened. That was how she loved him now, not by asking him to be strong, but by becoming one of the few places where he did not have to pretend so hard. Jack told her he had an important contract signing this morning. If it went through, the company might finally have a way to breathe again. He tried to say it lightly, but she knew how much was hidden under those few words. Too much had been balanced on maybe lately. Too many hopes had already fallen through. She smiled anyway and told him he looked like a real director. When he answered with a tired half-smile, she gently reminded him that sincerity mattered more than appearance. It was the kind of sentence only Tu Tien could say, simple, warm, and somehow able to steady him without sounding like comfort. Then Jack apologized for leaving her alone again. He looked at the drying harvest, at the baskets, at the road she would soon walk to the market, and shame moved quietly through him. He had never wanted her to become the kind of woman who had to carry the burden of survival with both hands. He had wanted to shelter her, not watch her stand under the market sun counting every note and every coin. But Tu Tien only shook her head. "This is my work too," she told him softly. That answer stayed with him longer than any blessing could have. It did not remove his guilt. It made it harder and more beautiful at the same time. Before leaving, they reminded each other to eat, to be careful, to take care of their health. Ordinary words. Married words. The kind people speak every day without realizing how precious they become when life is unstable. Jack promised he would come pick her up after the market. Then he left. Tu Tien stood there, watching him disappear down the dirt road until the space around her felt larger and emptier again. Pride rose in her chest, but so did worry. Loving a man under pressure was like watching someone walk into deep water every morning and praying he would still be standing by evening. Inside the car, Jack's composure broke first in silence. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. His mind moved where his eyes could not, toward his mother, toward Tu Tien, toward all the women in his life who had suffered more than they ever should have because he had not yet managed to pull them fully out of danger. He had once believed that effort alone could fix a future. Lately, reality had taught him something crueler. Sometimes a man can try with all his strength and still feel powerless in front of the people he loves most. He drove on anyway. At the roadside water stall, Phuc was already waiting with the contract documents. The stack of papers between them looked clean, official, hopeful. They sat down, reviewed each clause carefully, checked the terms, the figures, the dates. Phuc spoke with the measured optimism of a loyal assistant who still believed this signing might mark the company's return. For a few minutes, Jack allowed himself to think the same. Then the phone rang. The partners' side informed them that the director had an unexpected matter and could not come sign today. That was all. No explosion, no insult, no public humiliation, just another delay, another promise moved further away, another day in which hope showed up only to leave again before lunch. Phuc looked at him anxiously. Jack stayed quiet for one beat too long, then told Phuc to go back to the construction site first and keep things moving. His voice was steady, his face was controlled, but the second Phuc left, the full weight of what had happened settled over him. This had not been just a meeting, it had been one more chance for the company to stop sinking. Now even that had slipped, and the day was still not finished with him. He sat in the car, took another call, and asked the real estate agent about the land. Were there any buyers? Had anyone decided yet? The answer came back with the cold bluntness of reality. The outer house plot might sell sooner, but the farmland still had no serious interest. Jack closed his eyes. Sell the outer land first, then. He said the words because he had to, not because they hurt less after being spoken aloud. Every decision now seemed to involve cutting away a piece of what they had built in order. Across the village, Tu Tien had already begun her own battle with the day. The market was noisy, hot, and alive with movement. Voices rose from every direction. Buyers walked past in waves. The scent of fresh vegetables, herbs, and cooked food drifted through the air. Tu Tien sat beside her basket of chilies and greeted each customer with the same patient smile, introducing the peppers one by one. Sweet, crisp, good for stir-fry, good for stuffing, good for salads, good for the kind of meal that makes a family feel cared for without spending too much. She did not know what had just happened to Jack. She only knew she needed to sell well. Every bundle she packed, every short conversation, every small transaction became part of the private promise she had made to herself. If life refused to become easier, then she would become stronger. Once, she had been frightened of crowded places. Once, she had not even believed she could stand at a market and sell anything with confidence. Now, she was doing it. Tired, sunburned, thirsty, but still doing it. In another corner of the day, Jack met someone else fate had quietly placed in his path. It was Bac Phuong, the older man he had once helped. They sat together for a while, and in that ordinary roadside meeting, the conversation turned unexpectedly sincere. The old man spoke of selling land in his hometown and of wanting to buy a small plot nearby to spend his old age in peace. He also made it clear that he had cut ties completely with the people who had once tied his life into humiliation and pain. Jack listened, then told him a little of the truth. Not everything. Men like Jack rarely say everything. But enough. Enough to make clear that money was tight, that work was unstable, that land might need to be sold. The older man did not offer empty comfort. He offered what mattered more: recognition, gratitude, and the suggestion that if there was a way to support Jack later, he would not forget what had once been done for him. It was not rescue, but it was one more reminder that kindness does not always vanish. Sometimes it circles back quietly, arriving exactly when a man needs to remember the world is not made entirely of loss. By late afternoon, Tu Tien had finally finished selling. Her body ached, but relief had already softened her face. She bought sugar, waited by the roadside, and called Jack to say she was done. Her voice was tired, but warm. He told her he was on the way and would be there soon. That should have been the end of the day. He would pick her up, they would go home, she would cook, he would hide how disappointed he felt about the contract. They would survive one more ordinary hard day. But life had prepared something else. As Jack drove toward the market, his eyes passed over a dark patch near the roadside. At first, it looked like debris, or maybe a pile of cloth thrown carelessly into the dust. Then the shape resolved itself into the body of a young woman lying motionless on the ground. He hit the brakes instantly. Tu Tien, who had just stood up at the sight of his car, followed his gaze. In 1 second, the emotional color of the whole day changed. The market sounds seemed to move further away. The sunlight itself felt colder. There was a young woman there, still, unconscious, alone. Jack ran first. Tu Tien was right behind him. They crouched beside the stranger and saw enough to know this was no fainting spell. There were signs of an accident. The girl's breathing was shallow. Her skin was pale. Dust clung to her clothes and hair as if she had been lying there longer than anyone should have allowed. For one beat, both of them froze, not because they did not care, but because the shock was too sudden. Then their instincts took over. Jack looked around for help. There was none. Tu Tien touched the girl's arm, spoke to her, tried to wake her, but the young woman did not respond. There was no time to hesitate. They lifted her into the car and drove straight to the hospital. Inside the white, cold light of the emergency hallway, Jack handled the paperwork, the admission, the first costs, the questions. Tu Tien stayed beside the girl, holding her hand, talking softly to her even while she remained unconscious. They did not know her name. They did not know where she came from. They did not know whether helping her would drag them into another complication when they could barely manage their own lives. And yet neither of them stepped back. Because that is the thing about people like Jack and Tu Tien. Hardship had made them tired, but it had not emptied them of compassion. When the young woman finally regained consciousness later, she was weak, confused, and fragile. Tu Tien sat by her bed feeding her warm porridge slowly, spoon by spoon, as if she were caring for someone from her own family. Jack stood nearby watching his wife and feeling something shift inside him. All day he had moved through disappointment, debt, canceled hope, and the bitter calculations of survival. But here, in this quiet hospital room, he was forced to see another truth. Even now, they still had something to give. Late that night, after the worst of the tension had eased, Jack and Tu Tien sat together in the hospital corridor. They were exhausted, emotionally drained, and still far from safe in their own lives. The contract had not been signed. The land still had to be sold. The company was still unstable. Nothing practical had become easier, but something inside them had. Jack put his arm around her shoulders and thanked her. Not only for the market, not only for standing beside him through pressure, but for remaining the kind of woman who could still bend over a stranger's bedside and offer comfort without calculation. Tu Tien smiled through tears. She was tired enough to cry easily now, but not from weakness, from relief, from love, from the strange peace that sometimes appears only after people have done the right thing in the middle of a hard day. And perhaps that is why this script can work much better for retention if treated correctly. The emotional engine is already there, but it must be revealed faster, harder, and in clearer beats. The first 2 minutes should not linger too long on drying melons, polite conversation, and internal guilt. They should move like this. Jack leaves for the contract. The signing collapses. Tu Tien fights through the market. Jack meets Baek Fyung. Tu Tien calls. The unconscious girl appears. Every segment should escalate. Every new scene should either increase pressure or open a new emotional question. Because the strongest thing in this story is not the market, the contract, or even the accident by itself. It is the contrast. They are already drowning, and still they choose kindness. That is what makes the day matter. That is what makes the audience stay.